As Thaddeus Carmichael remained motionless on his front steps, clutching his firearm, a crimson trail led directly to his water source. He saw red drops disappear into the dawn's darkness. Something wild had entered his shelter and appeared to be injured and frantic. Thad had learned to interpret every natural sign after being isolated for 24 months at his Colorado settlement. The blood was not that of a deer because it was too thick and planned. This was not an injured animal looking for water. Rather, it was something that moved deliberately even though it was bleeding, understood human homes well enough to find the only clean water source miles away. His worn boots found the quietest path through the scattered foliage as he followed the path expertly. Every droplet told a story of pain, determination, and struggle for survival. The dawn atmosphere held scents he couldn't entirely identify. Untamed sage, pine, and something additional that made his flesh prickle with primordial alarm. The path led to an old smokehouse he rarely used, past a storage building and the empty poultry enclosure he had left behind after Margaret's death. The blood spots got bigger and more frequent. The bleeding was getting weaker and slower. He raised the weapon and gently pressed his finger against the mechanism. Then he saw her, a young woman staring back at it with eyes that showed no human awareness, hunched behind the smokehouse like a prey trap. Her clothes were, if they were worthy of that description, fragments of creature hide barely covering her form, and her long, black hair was tangled with soil and foliage. Her fair skin was stained with fresh blood as a severe wound extended across her left limb. Thad's pulse, on the other hand, was slowed by her posture. She wasn't seated or kneeling as any individual would. She balanced on her toe tips, prepared to leap in any direction. Her curved hands pressed against the ground like talons. She didn't scream or ask for help when she saw him. Every instinct in him screamed. This wasn't a woman. This was something that had lost the knowledge of being human. She showed her teeth and let out a quiet, menacing snarl. She looked at him with an unnatural angle of her head, like a hunter would look at game. Those wild eyes didn't look scared. They just looked at things. She expanded her nostrils to determine whether his scent represented danger or opportunity. Blood continued dropping from her injured arm, yet she displayed no recognition of discomfort. Thoughts racing, Thad slowly lowered his weapon. How long had she existed out there? How did she persevere? And why did it feel like he was looking into his own mirror when he was observing her? Something that was damaged and had lost its way back to humanity. He realized that she was preparing to flee back into the wilderness that had molded her, back to whatever group or solitude had sustained her survival, as she stepped backward in a graceful and silent manner. In moments, she would disappear like vapor, and he would never determine if this encounter had been genuine or merely another vision born from excessive lonely evenings. But he did what every sensible man would avoid because of something in her gaze, a glimpse of physical pain. He made his way forward. The growl that emerged from her throat promised brutality. Her muscles tensioned like a mechanism loaded with death, and Thaddeus Carmichael, for the first time in 2 years, felt genuinely alive again. Because some meetings are fate disguised as danger, and some outsiders carried solutions to doors we weren't aware we had secured. What happened next would forever change both of their lives. Thad placed his rifle against the smokehouse wall and lifted both hands, palms visible. The universal sign of peace meant nothing to her. She tracked his every move with the intensity of a hawk following a rodent, and her growl became so loud that it could be heard throughout the morning. Before Margaret's death, he had worked with wild horses, earned their trust, and mastered their language of fear and survival. This, on the other hand, was unique in that it was a human spirit encased in wolf instincts, and he had no idea which nature would prevail. Moving with intentional slowness, he reached into his vest pocket and extracted a piece of dried beef jerky. When she smelled the odor, her nostrils immediately flared. The groaning stopped. She tilted her head even more, confused rather than hostile. She knew about food, but she didn't know about sharing. Thad retreated after throwing the jerky in the middle of them. She did not immediately advance for it. Instead, she studied his face, searching for deception, for the snare she anticipated. She crept forward on all fours while he remained motionless, keeping her gaze fixed on him. With teeth that had clearly spent years consuming raw flesh, she seized a jerky and retreated to her corner. He noticed details that made his stomach tighten as she ate. Her arms and legs were covered in old scars from living in conditions that no human should have to endure. Years of digging and clawing had shaped her thick, yellowed fingernails. He caught his breath when he saw what lay beneath the wild exterior. She was beautiful in a way that was hard to explain. Not the sophisticated beauty Margaret had, but something fierce and wild, like a storm given human form. She looked at him expectantly after finishing her meal, not with gratitude, but rather with the practical evaluation of a predator pondering whether this source would supply additional food. He extended his reach for another piece of jerky toward her this time. Her breathing became faster as she looked at his extended hand with a great deal of skepticism. He could see through her features the internal conflict. Trust meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant death. But hunger was a language older than fear. He could now see the golden flecks in her brown eyes, feel her pulse pounding at her throat, smell the wild sage in her hair, and observe how she held her injured arm in protective position against her body as she cautiously moved closer. As she reached for the jerky, their fingers almost touched, but something shocked her, a bird calling in the distance, the wind rustling his old barn. She hissed like an enraged feline as she jerked backward. Thad made his second risky decision of the morning at that point. He sat cross-legged in the dirt and waited rather than pursuing her. As soon as he closed his eyes, he became as still as a stone, his muscles relaxed, and any threat vanished. The time elapsed. The sun climbed higher, warming his face. He noticed her getting closer once more, carefully, as the birds resumed their morning songs. She was just outside of his reach when he opened his eyes, looking at him with an expression he couldn't understand. Not quite human, not quite animal. Caught in the middle of two worlds, neither of which had shown her mercy. However, in that silence, something changed between them. Perhaps recognition, or simply the realization that they were both creatures who had learned to survive on their own. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance shattered the moment. Every muscle in her body tightened as her head shot up. She knew right away by her reaction that riders were approaching. The Brennan brothers from town were riding hard toward Thad's property with a purpose that promised nothing good, and the voices he heard in the wind made his blood run cold. Before Thad could blink, she was gone. One moment she was sitting in front of him. The next, she was gone like morning mist. He heard a faint rustle coming from the old loft of his barn, but when he looked, nothing was there. Similar to how most people learn to breathe, she had learned to disappear. The harsh voices of men who had never been taught to resolve conflicts peacefully accompanied the increasing volume of the hoofbeats. As he stood to retrieve his rifle, Thad's thoughts were racing with possibilities. The Brennan brothers didn't ride out to his property for social visits. They came when they wanted something, and they usually wanted it badly enough to take it by force. Brothers Caleb and Marcus Brennan, in addition to Owen, their cousin, were the three riders who ascended the hill that overlooked his homestead, men who'd made careers out of other people's misfortune. Caleb rode point with his black hat pulled low over his eyes, which had never shown compassion. Owen's hand rested on the pistol on his hip, while Marcus carried a coiled rope that had seen too much use behind him. They formed a loose semicircle around Thad, boxing him in against his own barn, and reined in their horses 20 feet from where he was standing. Caleb smiled so hard it could break glass as he leant forward in his saddle. He said, "Morning, Carmichael. Heard you might be keeping something you don't own." Thad kept his expression neutral, though his grip tightened on his rifle. "Caleb, you have no idea what you're talking about. It has been a quiet morning." "Is it so?" Near Thad's boots, Marcus spit tobacco juice into the ground. Because old Pete from the general store claims that he saw tracks yesterday. They were wolf tracks, but they were bigger and stranger, following a blood trail that went straight toward your property. Owen's horse pranced nervously. Picking up on tensions his rider was too stupid to read. Naturally, Pete has been known to see things after drinking whiskey. However, Mrs. Clearwater teen swears that something howled outside his bedroom window 2 nights ago, and Henderson mentioned missing chickens. Thad's blood got colder. If they were tracking her, if they connected her to the recent disturbances around town, she was in more danger than just exposure and starvation. Men like the Brennans didn't capture what they feared. They destroyed it. Thad said slowly, "A lot of wild animals in these parts. Has always been. Don't see how that concerns me." Caleb's smile widened and revealed yellow teeth from malice and tobacco use. See, neighbor, that's where you're wrong. Due to the fact that we have a bounty situation. $50 for whatever's been terrorizing the good folks of Cedar Ridge. We find it, put it down, and pay the town council $50 for it. The majority of these men haven't seen $50 in 3 months. Enough to make them hunt with the dedication of professionals and the cruelty of amateurs. We figure you won't mind if we take a look around your property, Marcus continued, releasing his rope from his saddle horn. And seeing as how the trail leads here, just being neighborly and all. Thad moved into a more prepared position with his rifle. I mind plenty. This is private property, and you boys aren't welcome here. The temperature between them dropped 10 degrees. Marcus started weighing the weight of his rope as Owen's hand got closer to his gun. Thad was most concerned, though, because Caleb's eyes had become cold and flat, giving the impression of a man calculating angles and distances. That's rude, Carmichael. Now that's rude. Downright suspicious, if you ask me. Makes men wonder where you might be hiding. What kind of secrets a widower who is grieving might keep to alleviate his loneliness? Thad was physically shattered by the implication. They weren't just hunting an animal. They were hunting something they believed was human, something they could blame for their fears and collect money for destroying. And they were suggesting he was protecting it for reasons that would destroy his reputation in town permanently. From the loft of the barn came a barely audible sound that was clearly the creak of aged with underweight, like a bloodhound looking for a scent. Caleb turned to hear the sound. He said, dismounting with practiced ease, "Well now. Seems like we may not have to look for very long after all." With his rifle now pointed squarely at Caleb's chest, Thad stepped in between the barn and the man. "You are not looking for anything. Please leave my property." But even as he spoke, he could hear more sounds from the loft. She was trapped up there, and she knew it. The question was whether she'd try to fight her way out or trust him to handle the situation. Both options could result in their deaths. Caleb took another step forward, and Thad's finger found the trigger. One shot was all he'd get before the other two drew their weapons. He had one chance to choose whether he would die protecting a stranger or live knowing that he had fed her to two-legged wolves. The choice should have been easy, but nothing about this morning had been easy, and he was beginning to suspect easy was no longer an option. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Caleb's hand hovered near his gun, while Thad's rifle remained trained on his chest. Marcus and Owen had spread out, trying to flank him, but Thad knew these tactics. He'd survived worse odds during his army days, back when survival meant more than protecting empty land and bitter memories. Another creak from the loft. Caleb's grin turned prey-like. You should be aware, Carmichael, that interfering with a legitimate bounty hunt carries repercussions, particularly when decent people are reluctant to let their kids play outside. Caleb spoke in a whisper that sounded more like a threat than a shout. Makes people wonder what kind of man you really are. Like the smoke from a funeral pyre, the accusation hung in the air. Reputation was worth a lot in a place like Cedar Ridge, and Caleb had just threatened to put him out of business. A widowed farmer who was protecting something the town thought was dangerous would become something even worse than a pariah, a target. But as Thad stared into Caleb's cold eyes, he realized something that surprised him. He didn't care about his reputation anymore. Hadn't cared about much of anything since Margaret died. None of it mattered to him. The isolation, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the general store, the pitiful looks from women who used to call him a friend. What mattered was a memory of wild eyes that had looked at him without judgment, eyes that belonged to a person who had learned to live without compromise, who had learned to trust nothing and no one, and who had nevertheless reached for the food that he had provided. Owen, Caleb called without taking his eyes off Thad. Circle around back. Marcus, go back to the smokehouse. I'm sick of games, and our quarry is close by. This was the moment. The crossroads where Thad had to choose between the safe path and the right one, between protecting himself and protecting someone who couldn't protect herself, between the man he'd been and the man he could become. She's not an animal, Thad said quietly, his rifle still aimed at Caleb's heart. She is a human being, still a person, despite being scared and hurt. Like stones falling into still water, the words fell between them. Caleb's expression changed from one of predatory confidence to one of man who had just confirmed his worst suspicions, something far more perilous. She? Marcus stepped closer, rope ready. You've been hiding a woman up there? Who is this wild woman who slaughters livestock? Thad provided a response, the kind that's been surviving alone in conditions that would break any of you in a week. The kind that deserves a chance to remember what it means to be human. Owen had reached the back of the barn, through the old wood. Thad could hear him testing the rear door, looking for another way in. Time was running out, and she was trapped between armed men who saw her as either a monster to be destroyed or something worse. Caleb drew his pistol in one smooth motion. Lower your rifle, Carmichael, right now, or I'll assume you're as dangerous as whatever you're protecting. 3 guns against 1. There was a woman in the loft who had the potential to run away, fight, or do something unexpected that would result in their deaths. The smart move was surrender. Compromise was the safest option. However, Thad reflected on Margaret's last words to him before she succumbed to the fever, that she had compelled him to find something he could live for once more, something that would keep him from becoming a ghost in his own life. He had discovered it, and he would be damned if he allowed the Brennan brothers to destroy it in exchange for 50 silver coins. No, Thad said, and meant it down to his bones. In Cedar Ridge, the ensuing gunfight will be talked about for a long time. But everything Thad thought he knew about the woman hiding in his barn would change in the seconds before the first shot was fired. Because some people are born wild, and some people are made wild by circumstances beyond their control. Only a select few, however, make the decision to go wild out of their own free will. They decide that simply surviving isn't enough, and that there are some things that are worth fighting for even when the odds are against them. Owen fired the first shot at the barn's back door, not at Thad, but as a warning shot into the air. Everything that followed happened in heartbeats after the sound shattered the morning's silence like glass. Just as Thad's rifle spoke, Caleb's gun cleared leather. Caleb was shot in the shoulder high, causing him to spin around and drop his pistol into the ground. Marcus raised his weapon, but something impossible occurred before he could fire. She fell from a hayloft like a falling star, smashing through the side window of the loft in a conflagration of broken glass and wood. She didn't go through the door or down a ladder. She fell 20 feet to ground and landed in a crouch that absorbed the force like she had been born to fall from heights that ought to have broken bones. Marcus aimed his gun at her as he turned toward the new threat, but she was already moving in the opposite direction, directly toward him, not away from it. When cornered, when every instinct turns to violence, when survival demands blood, a mountain lion scream came out of her throat. It wasn't human. Marcus got one shot off, wild panic, missing by inches, before she hit him like a force of nature. She held on to Marcus's gun arm with teeth that had learned to hold or die as they went down together, causing Marcus' horse to rear and scream. Thad's property was bordered by a creek when the weapon flew for his grasp and spun around. Owen ran straight toward the barn, his face pale with fear. It wasn't this or a woman moving like liquid death or Marcus screaming as she held him down with strength that seemed impossible for her size, whatever he had expected to find. Thad swung his rifle toward Owen, but the man was already retreating, his weapon forgotten in his need to put distance between himself and something his mind couldn't process. Jesus Christ. Owen yelled and stumbled backwards. What exactly is that? Caleb struggled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face twisted with pain and fury. His shirt became a dark red color as blood seeped between his fingers. Kill her. He screamed at Owen. Kill the goddamn animal. However, Owen was already on his horse because he was in too much of a panic to be loyal to his cousins. He replied, "I didn't sign up for this," and steered his horse toward the hills. This is not organic. With a snarl, she let go of Marcus and turned toward Caleb, bringing her lips back to show teeth stained by blood that wasn't hers. With a shocked expression on his face, Marcus rolled off while holding on to his broken arm. The rope he'd planned to use on her lay forgotten in the dirt, and he made no move to retrieve it. Caleb's violent bleeding, Marcus broken and wailing, and Owen's complete retreat over the hill interrupted the tableau for a brief moment. She stood in the middle of it all like a vengeful spirit, her wild hair catching the morning light, and her eyes held rage-filled depths that spoke of years of being persecuted by men like these. With his rifle still ready and pointed safely upward, Thad stepped in between her and Caleb. "It's over," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd seen real war. "Get off my property and take your cousin with you. Never come back." Caleb's good hand moved toward a knife at his belt, but one look at her face changed his mind. She tracked his every movement, like a predator watching prey, and something in her posture promised that the next man who threatened violence would find more of it than he could handle. "This isn't finished, Carmichael," Caleb hissed through gritted teeth. "Town council's going to hear about this. About what you're harboring. About what attacked us." Thad replied, "Tell them anything you want, but you came on my property armed and threatening. I defended what's mine." The word surprised him as much as they surprised Caleb. What's mine? When had he started thinking of her that way? When had protecting her become more important than protecting himself? Marcus was helped to his feet by Caleb, and the two of them stumbled toward their remaining horses. Caleb's shoulder would need attention soon, or infection would finish what the bullet had started, so Marcus' arm hung uselessly at his side. Caleb issued a final threat as they rode away. $50, Carmichael. Someone's going to collect it, and when they do, they'll remember who stood in their way. Thad was left alone with her for the first time since the confrontation had begun as the sound of hoofbeats vanished into the distance. She stood perfectly still, watching the horizon where the riders had disappeared, her breathing quick and shallow. When she finally turned to look at him, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. The recognition that he had put her ahead of his own safety and stood in the way of men who would have destroyed her immediately. She took a step in his direction and then stopped, tilting her head in that familiar way. And for the first time since he'd found her, she spoke. One word, barely a whisper, shaped by vocal cords of forgotten human speech, but unmistakably, impossibly, a word he understood. "Kestrel," she said, touching her chest with one bloodstained hand. Her name. She'd given him her name, and in that moment, Thaddeus Carmichael realized he was no longer protecting a wild animal or even a lost woman. He was guarding someone who had recently rescued her humanity from the wilderness where she had been raised. But as he watched her clean Marcus's blood from her teeth with the back of her hand, he wondered if humanity was something she could fully reclaim, or she'd become something new entirely, something the world had never seen before, something that would need him as much as he was beginning to need her. The name hung between them, like a bridge neither quite knew how to cross. Kestrel, it fit her perfectly. The sharp intelligence of a hunting bird, the wildness that couldn't be caged, the grace that came from living always on the edge of flight or fight. Thad holstered his rifle and moved slowly toward the water pump near his porch. Blood still stained her hands and mouth, and while part of him understood the violence had been necessary, another part worried about what she might do if threatened again. He worked the pump handle until clean water flowed, then gestured for her to come closer. She approached with the same careful calculation she'd shown earlier, but something had changed. The desperate edge was gone, replaced by a curious wariness that seemed almost human. When she reached the pump, she didn't immediately understand its purpose. Her head tilted as she studied the flowing water, clearly puzzled by the concept of water appearing from metal and wood, to get rid of the morning's tension and dust. Thad submerged his hands in the stream and applied water to his own face. She watched intently, then mimicked his movements. She jerked back, took a sharp breath, and her eyes widened in surprise when the cold water hit her skin. He suddenly realized that she probably had never experienced cold, clean water from a pump. Raindrop puddles, creek water, and other natural resources had all been necessary for her survival. She was as foreign to this simple convenience as he was to her wild life. She tried once more, this time anticipating the cold shock. Thad glimpsed the woman beneath her wilderness survival instincts as she washed her hands and face of blood. Her actions became less impulsive and more deliberate. She even seemed to enjoy the sensation, closing her eyes as water dripped from her chin. However, their tranquil moment was disrupted when new sounds spread throughout the valley. This time, more horses. A lot more. When the Brennan brothers got to town, it appeared that they had persuaded others to join their cause. The transformation of Kestrel was complete and instantaneous. Her hands clenched into claws as every muscle in her body tightened, and the wild look that had left her eyes doubled in intensity. She spun toward the approaching sounds, a low growl building in her throat. Even though his own heart was pounding against his ribs, Thad said softly, "Easy, simple girl." He counted at least 6 riders through the trees, town men who had heard the Brennan brothers' account and decided $50 was worth the risk. Men who convinced themselves they were hunting a monster, not a person. Kestrel backed away from the barn, flitting her eyes between potential escape routes. However, Thad was aware that running would only delay the inescapable. These men would follow her until they located her, and the next time, she might not have been warned. He urged her to pay attention and move to prevent her retreat. They'll hunt you forever if you run, put you in a cage, or something worse if they find you like an animal. However, we can demonstrate to them that you are not who they believe you to be if you remain and trust me. She understood more than he had anticipated and violently shook her head. Except for him, her interactions with humans had taught her that groups of men meant suffering, terror, and probably death. She was screamed to flee by every instinct. Thad's stomach dropped as the riders reached the top of the hill. Sheriff Watson led them with a purposeful grimace on his face and a badge that shone in the sunlight. Behind him rode Deputy Carson, the town mayor, and 4 more men Thad recognized from church services he no longer attended. Respectable men who convinced themselves they were protecting their community. Sheriff Watson had always been straightforward but fair. No amount of talking would change his mind if he came to arrest or kill the animal he thought was dangerous. Additionally, this was now considered official town business with the mayor present. Kestrel, Thad said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "Do you comprehend what I'm trying to say? They will attempt to take you away and possibly kill you. The only chance we have is if you let me show them you're not dangerous." She made a sound that was at once a snarl and a laugh. Not dangerous? She just proved exactly how dangerous she could be when cornered. Blood still stained the dirt where Marcus had fallen, and her teeth still carried the taste of violence. The riders were close enough now that Thad could see Sheriff Watson's expression. It was a look of a man who'd come to do an unpleasant job and intended to see it through regardless of complications. "That is Carmichael." Watson's voice carried across the yard with official authority. "We must discuss what transpired here this morning and what you were concealing." Kestrel tensed like a spring loaded with death, ready to fight or flee. She would make a decision in a matter of seconds that would determine whether she lived as something other than an animal or died as something else. And Thad came to the realization that her decision would also determine what kind of man Thad would become. A man who would watch helplessly as fear destroyed innocence, or one who would have learned that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The riders formed a semicircle around his property, cutting off escape routes with practiced efficiency. However, they made a crucial error when they believed that she was the only danger on his land. Sheriff Watson dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd learned not to underestimate any situation. Though he hadn't drawn yet, his hand was resting on the butt of his gun, giving Thad hope that this wouldn't escalate into more bloodshed. "Morning, Thad," Watson called, his voice carrying the weight of official business mixed with personal regret. "Wish I was here for social reasons, but the Brennan boys came into town with some disturbing claims. Alleged that you were storing something dangerous when you attacked them." "The Brennan boys came onto my property armed and threatening," Thad replied, positioning himself between Kestrel and the semicircle of riders. "I stood up for what is mine." Mayor Hutchkins, a soft man who'd never faced real danger, leaned forward in his saddle. "They said it was a woman, Thad, a wild woman who, acting like an animal, attacked Marcus. Bit him so bad Doc Peterson had to stitch the wounds." Kestrel remained perfectly still behind Thad, but he could feel her tension radiating like forged heat. She understood enough to know these men represented the same threat as the Brennans, just with more official authority. "Her name is Kestrel," Thad said quietly, and she defended herself when 3 armed men cornered her like prey. In his saddle, Deputy Carson, who was just 20 years old and eager to show his worth, shifted nervously. "Thad, a wild woman cannot be kept on your property. It is unsafe for the community and not natural." The word natural hit Thad like a physical blow. What was natural about a child left in the middle of nowhere? What was natural about forcing someone to survive alone from infancy, learning to trust nothing and no one? What was natural about men who'd rather destroy what they didn't understand than try to help it heal? She's not wild by choice, Thad said, his voice carrying an edge that made several horses prance nervously. She's wild because she had to be, because no one else had a concern to assist her in remembering how to be human. Sheriff Watson studied Thad's face with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years reading guilt and innocence. Where'd she come from? Thad? How long has she been here? Found her this morning. Wounded, hungry, scared. Did what any decent man would do. Offered food and shelter. Thad kept his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. What the Brennan boys did was hunt her like an animal for bounty money. Bounty money the town council authorized, Mayor Hutchins interjected, his voice taking on a pompous tone. $50 or whatever has terrorized our citizens, killed livestock, and scared children. Thad felt Kestrel tense behind him. The mention of them hunting her for money brought back memories of other men, threats, and situations from which she had barely escaped with her life. She understood more of their conversation than anyone else did. Sheriff Watson yelled, "Show yourself, miss," as he passed Thad. "Nobody's going to hurt you if you cooperate, but we need to see what we're dealing with." Like a tense wire, the silence grew. Kestrel then slowly emerged from behind Thad. Although she moved with grace and fluidity, her posture remained that of a predator prepared to fight. She swept the gathered men with icy calculation, classifying threats and plotting escapes. The riders' collective exhalations could be heard. It wasn't this, not someone who looked so human and moved so differently from anything they'd ever seen. Not someone who was both beautiful and dangerous enough to make mature men uncomfortable in their saddles. "Jesus," Deputy Carson whispered. "She is simply a girl," Mayor Hutchins rebutted. "A girl who tore Marcus Brennan's arm open with her teeth, though his voice lacked conviction earlier. A girl who lives like an animal and attacks decent men." Kestrel's lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth that had indeed tasted blood that morning. She did not, however, growl or crouch. Rather, she stood straight and directly met Sheriff Watson's gaze, urging him to view her as a human rather than a beast. "Miss, what's your story?" Watson asked gently. "Where are your individuals? How did you come to be living wild?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved from face to face, reading intentions, measuring threats. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough from disuse but unmistakably human. "No people," she said slowly, each word carefully shaped. "Only wolves, only forest, only survive." The assembled men were physically shattered by her simple honesty. This wasn't a monster or a wild animal. Rather, it was a person who had been left behind and forgotten, and had spent years learning to live in conditions that would have killed any other person in a matter of days. However, Mayor Hutchins remained unwilling to resign. Regardless of her circumstances, she's dangerous. The attack on the Brennan boys proves that. We cannot allow someone who is erratic to reside near our town. Unpredictable? Righteous rage rose in Thad's voice. She defended herself as 3 armed men encircled her like prey. "If you were in the same predicament, what would you do?" Sheriff Watson asked for silence with a hand raised. "The question is, what happens now, miss? Can you coexist peacefully with other people? When threatened, can you control your instincts?" No one else could tell what was happening between Kestrel and Thad when he looked at him. Trust, perhaps, or simply the realization that their fates were now intertwined, whether they wanted them to or not. She finally said, "Learn, want no more." The 2 words carried more weight than any speech. She wasn't just talking about learning to live with other people. Rather, she was talking about learning to be human once more in order to regain something that the wilderness had taken away from her. However, the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats before Sheriff Watson could respond. Thad's blood turned to ice when he saw the lead horse as the new riders reached the top of the hill. Caleb Brennan had returned with his arm in a crude sling and his angry, twisted face. But what he brought was even worse than his presence. Men who wouldn't be influenced by local politics or personal appeals. Men who'd been told they were looking for a killer and had the authority to shoot first and ask questions later, and federal marshals with warrants and weapons. They wouldn't be able to save either of them this time by talking as the actual fight was about to begin. Men who had spent years pursuing dangerous fugitives across wild territories rolled with the icy efficiency of federal marshals. Marshal Hayes, an aged man with steel-gray eyes, dismounted and walked up to the group with the papers in hand. Marshal Porter watched the scene with professional suspicion behind him, rifle in hand. "We have a warrant for the capture of a dangerous individual reported to be on your property," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Thaddeus Carmichael. Please step aside."